The year is 30 AD. A dusty marketplace in Capernaum buzzes with the usual chaos of commerce and conversation. Roman soldiers patrol the streets, their metal sandals clicking against stone as they collect taxes for an empire that rules with an iron fist. In the shadows of Colonnade, a carpenter's son speaks words that will echo through millennia. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. 2,000 years later, that same phrase appears on campaign buttons, political rallies, and heated debates across social media. Politicians invoke Jesus' name as they promise to make their nations great again. Evangelical voters pack polling stations, convinced they're carrying out divine will. Progressive Christians march with signs declaring, "What would Jesus do?" as they fight for social justice. But here's the question that keeps historians, theologians, and political scientists awake at night. If Jesus of Nazareth walked among us today, would he even bother to vote? The answer might surprise you. In fact, it might completely shatter everything you think you know about the intersection of faith and politics. Let's start with what we know for certain. Jesus lived under one of history's most oppressive political systems. The Roman Empire wasn't just authoritarian, it was a machine designed to extract wealth from conquered peoples while crushing any hint of resistance. The Jewish population in first-century Palestine existed in a state of constant political tension, caught between collaboration with Rome and dreams of liberation. Yet nowhere in the Gospels do we find Jesus organizing voter registration drives or endorsing candidates for the Sanhedrin. This absence becomes even more striking when we consider the political landscape of Jesus' time. The Jewish world was fractured into distinct political factions, each with their own vision for the future. The Pharisees sought to preserve Jewish identity through strict religious observance. The Sadducees collaborated with Roman authorities, believing pragmatic accommodation was the path to survival. The Zealots advocated for armed revolution against the occupying forces. The Essenes had essentially given up on earthly politics altogether, retreating to desert communities to await divine intervention. Jesus encountered representatives from all these groups. He dined with tax collectors who worked for Rome. He debated with Pharisees who opposed Roman rule. His own disciples included Simon the Zealot, a former revolutionary. Yet Jesus never aligned himself politically with any faction. Dr. Marcus Borg, the late biblical scholar, noted something fascinating in his research. Jesus consistently refused to be co-opted by the political movements of his day, even when they shared some of his concerns. This wasn't political cowardice or indifference, it was something far more radical. Consider the famous incident when Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Caesar. His questioners weren't seeking genuine spiritual guidance, they were setting a trap. If Jesus said yes, pay the taxes, he'd be seen as a collaborator with the oppressive Roman system. If he said no, he'd be marked as a political rebel, subject to immediate arrest. Instead of choosing sides, Jesus performed what can only be described as a masterclass in political jujitsu. He asked to see a coin, examined the image of Caesar stamped upon it, and delivered those immortal words about rendering unto Caesar and unto God. But what most people miss is the deeper implication of his response. By asking whose image was on the coin, Jesus was making a subtle but profound theological point. Just as the coin bore Caesar's image, human beings bear the image of God. The question wasn't really about taxes at all, it was about ultimate allegiance and the proper ordering of earthly and divine authority. This brings us to our first major insight. Jesus seemed far less concerned with changing political systems than with transforming human hearts. His kingdom wasn't of this world, as he told Pontius Pilate, but that didn't mean he was indifferent to worldly suffering. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into history's most fascinating questions. I'm your host, and today we're exploring a topic that bridges ancient history and modern politics in ways you never imagined. But before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it where you are? Are you a student cramming for an exam, a teacher preparing lessons, or maybe someone who just loves getting lost in historical rabbit holes? Drop a comment and let me know what brought you to this question about Jesus and politics. Now, back to our investigation. If we're going to understand whether Jesus would vote in modern elections, we need to examine how he actually engaged with the power structures of his time. The gospel accounts reveal a pattern that's both consistent and surprising. Jesus repeatedly challenged authority, but rarely in ways that modern political activists would recognize. He healed on the Sabbath, defying religious law. He associated with outcasts and sinners, violating social norms. He cleansed the temple, confronting economic exploitation. Yet he also told his followers to turn the other cheek and love their enemies. Dr. John Dominic Crossan, one of the world's leading Jesus scholars, argues that Jesus practiced what he calls the politics of the kingdom of God, a radical alternative to both violent revolution and passive collaboration. This wasn't about seizing political power, but about demonstrating a completely different way of organizing human relationships. The early Christian communities seem to have understood this distinction. Despite facing severe persecution from Roman authorities, the earliest Christians didn't organize politically to change laws or elect sympathetic officials. Instead, they created alternative communities based on radical economic sharing, ethnic inclusion, and nonviolent resistance to injustice. This approach becomes even more intriguing when we consider the political opportunities available to early Christians. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, some Christians held positions of influence within the Roman system. Yet there's little evidence of coordinated political action aimed at Christianizing the empire from within. The real transformation came later, and it fundamentally changed everything. In 312 AD, something unprecedented happened. Emperor Constantine claimed to have had a vision of the Christian cross before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Whether you believe this was divine intervention or political calculation, the results were undeniable. Within a generation, Christianity went from a persecuted minority religion to the official faith of the Roman Empire. This transformation created what historian Gary Wills calls the Constantine problem, a tension that continues to shape Christianity's relationship with political power to this day. Once Christians gained access to the levers of state power, they faced questions Jesus never had to confront directly. How do you love your enemies when you have the power to destroy them? How do you turn the other cheek when you're responsible for protecting others? The medieval period saw the development of sophisticated theories about Christian participation in government. Thomas Aquinas argued that political authority could be legitimate if exercised justly and in accordance with divine law. Augustine developed the concept of the just war, attempting to reconcile Christian pacifism with the need to defend the innocent. Yet even these theological giants struggled with the fundamental tension between Jesus' radical teachings and the compromises required by political power. Augustine famously wrote about his anguish over ordering the execution of heretics, believing it necessary for social order while knowing it contradicted Jesus' example of mercy. Fast forward to the American founding era, and we encounter an even more complex picture. The United States was established by men who were deeply influenced by Christian thought, yet who created a system deliberately designed to prevent any single religious tradition from controlling political power. Thomas Jefferson, who famously created his own edited version of the Gospels, focused exclusively on Jesus' moral teachings while removing all supernatural elements. Jefferson clearly admired Jesus as a moral teacher, but seemed to believe his political relevance lay in personal ethics rather than governmental policy. This brings us to a crucial question. What would modern democracy even mean to someone from first-century Palestine? The concept of popular sovereignty, the idea that ultimate political authority rests with the people, would have been almost incomprehensible to Jesus and his contemporaries. Ancient political thought generally assumed that authority flowed downward from divine or royal sources. The Roman Empire, for all its brutality, at least provided order and stability. The idea that common people should choose their own leaders would have seemed like a recipe for chaos. Dr. N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Durham and renowned New Testament scholar, makes a compelling argument about this cultural gap. He suggests that Jesus' political vision was simultaneously more radical and more conservative than modern democracy. More radical because it demanded the complete transformation of human nature. More conservative because it assumed that lasting change comes through spiritual renewal rather than institutional reform. Consider Jesus' most famous political teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies. Do not resist an evildoer. These aren't policy positions that translate easily into campaign platforms. They're prescriptions for personal conduct that, if actually practiced, would revolutionize society from the ground up. But here's where things get really interesting. Modern political science research suggests that Jesus' approach might actually be more effective than traditional political activism in creating lasting social change. Studies of successful social movements consistently show that sustainable transformation requires what researchers call prefigurative politics, actually embodying the changes you want to see in society rather than simply advocating for them. The civil rights movement succeeded not just because activists demanded equal treatment under law, but because they demonstrated through their own conduct the dignity and moral authority they claimed. Martin Luther King Jr., who explicitly modeled his approach on Jesus' teachings, understood this principle intuitively. The Montgomery bus boycott worked because it combined legal challenges with what King called soul force, the moral power of people willing to suffer for justice rather than inflict suffering on others. This raises a fascinating possibility. Maybe Jesus would see modern democratic politics as a distraction from the more important work of social transformation. Think about it. Political campaigns require candidates to make promises they often can't keep, to oversimplify complex issues, and to demonize opponents. The very process of winning elections rewards traits that seem antithetical to Jesus' teachings about humility, truthfulness, and love for enemies. Moreover, democratic politics is fundamentally about managing competing interests within existing power structures. Jesus seemed more interested in exposing and transforming those structures altogether. His vision of the kingdom of God wasn't about better management of earthly kingdoms. It was about a completely different way of organizing human relationships. Dr. Shane Claiborne, a prominent Christian activist, puts it this way. Jesus didn't come to take sides in the culture wars. He came to take over, but his revolution looks nothing like what we expect. The early Christians seemed to understand this. They created communities that practiced radical economic sharing, not through government redistribution, but through voluntary mutual aid. They broke down ethnic barriers not through civil rights legislation, but through the simple act of eating together. They challenged gender hierarchies not through political movements, but by recognizing women as apostles and leaders. If you're finding this perspective thought-provoking, consider supporting Professor Archive with a super thanks. Your support helps us continue exploring these fascinating historical questions in depth. But let's push this analysis even further. What if we're asking the wrong question entirely? Instead of asking whether Jesus would vote, maybe we should ask, what would Jesus think about the assumptions underlying democratic politics? Modern democracy rests on several premises that would have been foreign to first-century thought. We assume that human beings are rational actors capable of making informed decisions about complex policy issues. We believe that competition between ideas leads to better outcomes. We trust that majority rule tempered by minority rights produces just results. Jesus, however, seemed to operate from fundamentally different assumptions about human nature and social change. His teachings suggest deep skepticism about human rationality, at least when it comes to moral and spiritual matters. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye but do not notice the log in your own eye? Rather than celebrating competition, Jesus advocated for radical cooperation. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Instead of majority rule, he spoke about the narrow path that few would choose to walk. This doesn't mean Jesus was anti-democratic in any modern sense. It means he was operating from an entirely different framework for understanding social change and human flourishing. Consider one of Jesus' most politically charged encounters, his interaction with Pontius Pilate during his trial. Pilate, representing the pinnacle of Roman political power, couldn't understand Jesus' claim to kingship. "My kingdom is not from this world," Jesus responded. If it were, his followers would be fighting to prevent his arrest. This wasn't a retreat from politics. It was a redefinition of what politics could be. Jesus was claiming authority over human hearts and minds, a form of power that no earthly government could match or eliminate. The implications are staggering. If Jesus were alive today, he might see both political parties as missing the point. Conservative Christians who want to legislate biblical morality might be told, as the Pharisees were, that they're putting heavy burdens on people without lifting a finger to help them. Progressive Christians who focus primarily on systemic change might be reminded that the kingdom of God comes not through human planning, but through spiritual transformation. But this raises an uncomfortable question for modern believers. If Jesus might not vote, does that make political engagement unchristian? The answer, I believe, is more nuanced than either political activism or withdrawal from public life. Throughout history, Christians have found creative ways to engage political systems while maintaining their primary allegiance to Jesus' teachings. Consider Dorothy Day, the Catholic social activist who spent her life serving the poor while consistently refusing to vote. She believed that participating in democratic politics would compromise her commitment to Christian pacifism, since governments inevitably rely on violence to enforce their will. Yet she was hardly politically passive. Her work with the Catholic worker movement challenged both government policies and social attitudes toward poverty and war. Or take Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who ultimately joined a plot to assassinate Hitler. Bonhoeffer agonized over this decision, knowing it contradicted his Christian principles. He chose political resistance not because he believed it was the Christian thing to do, but because he believed the stakes were so high that he was willing to accept personal damnation to save others. These examples suggest that the question isn't whether Christians should engage politics, but how they should do so while maintaining their distinctive witness to Jesus' teachings. Contemporary theologian Stanley Hauerwas argues that the Church's primary political task is simply to be the Church, to embody an alternative way of life that challenges the assumptions of secular politics through example rather than argument. When Christians practice radical hospitality, economic sharing, and nonviolent conflict resolution, they're making a political statement that's far more profound than any vote. This perspective finds surprising support from secular political theorists. Political scientist James C. Scott's research on everyday forms of resistance shows that oppressed peoples often create change more effectively through cultural practices and community building than through formal political channels. Jesus' approach seems to have anticipated these insights by 2 millennia. Rather than organizing to capture state power, he created a movement that transformed people's fundamental understanding of authority, community, and human worth. But here's the plot twist that changes everything. Jesus' most radical political act might have been his refusal to be political in conventional terms. By rejecting the role of political messiah that many of his followers expected, Jesus forced people to confront their deepest assumptions about power and change. His crucifixion wasn't political martyrdom in the traditional sense. It was the ultimate demonstration that God's power works through weakness, that true authority comes through service, and that lasting change requires spiritual rather than political transformation. The early Christians understood this paradox. They lived as citizens of heaven while residing on earth, rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's while reserving their ultimate allegiance for God. This wasn't political quietism. It was a form of resistance so radical that it ultimately transformed the Roman Empire from within. Modern Christians face a similar challenge. How do you participate in democratic societies while maintaining primary allegiance to a kingdom not of this world? How do you seek justice through political means while remembering that your most powerful weapon is love? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between political engagement and spiritual focus, but in understanding their proper relationship. Jesus' kingdom provides the vision and values that should guide political participation, while political engagement offers opportunities to approximate those values in partial and temporary ways. This means Christians might vote, but they shouldn't expect elections to usher in the kingdom of God. They might work for policy changes, but they should remember that their ultimate hope lies elsewhere. They might choose sides in political debates, but they should hold those commitments lightly, always ready to be prophetic critics of whatever party or movement they support. Dr. Richard Hayes of Duke Divinity School captures this tension beautifully. The church is called to be a community of resident aliens, maintaining dual citizenship in heaven and earth. We participate in earthly politics as necessary, but we never forget that our true citizenship lies elsewhere. So, would Jesus vote in modern elections? The honest answer is that we can't know for certain. The Gospels don't provide a clear policy platform or instructions for democratic participation. But we can say this: Jesus' approach to political power was so radically different from our contemporary assumptions that it challenges the very terms in which we ask the question. He wasn't interested in capturing state power or changing laws. He was interested in transforming human hearts and demonstrating alternative ways of organizing communities. If Jesus were alive today, he might vote, or he might not. But either way, his most important political contribution would likely come through embodying the values of his kingdom, rather than advocating for particular candidates or policies. The implications are profound for Christians across the political spectrum. Rather than asking what Jesus would do about immigration policy or tax rates, maybe they should ask, how can we embody radical hospitality and economic justice in our own communities? Instead of wondering which candidate Jesus would endorse, perhaps they should focus on becoming the kind of people who reflect his character, regardless of who holds political power. This isn't a retreat from political engagement. It's a call to engage politics in a fundamentally different way. It means working for justice while practicing mercy. It means seeking systemic change while focusing on personal transformation. It means participating in democratic processes while remembering that democracy itself is not the ultimate answer to human problems. The early Christians turned the Roman Empire upside down not through political organizing, but through the simple act of living differently. They cared for abandoned children, visited prisoners, shared resources with the poor, and refused to participate in violence. These weren't political strategies, they were expressions of their faith. Yet they had political consequences that outlasted emperors and empires. Modern Christians might learn from this example. Instead of asking whether Jesus would vote, perhaps they should ask, how can we live in ways that make God's kingdom visible in the world? How can we practice politics as discipleship rather than mere civic duty? The answer to these questions might transform not just how Christians engage politics, but how they understand their role in society altogether. It might lead to forms of political witness that transcend traditional categories of liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. Imagine Christian communities that practice radical economic sharing, not as socialist politics, but as kingdom living. Picture churches that welcome immigrants not as progressive activism, but as biblical hospitality. Envision believers who work for criminal justice reform not as liberal policy, but as expressions of divine mercy. Such communities might not fit neatly into existing political coalitions. They might find themselves criticizing both sides of contemporary debates while offering alternative approaches that neither side has considered. This kind of political engagement requires what theologian John Howard Yoder called revolutionary subordination, participating in worldly institutions while maintaining primary allegiance to kingdom values. It means being in the world but not of it, to use Jesus' own phrase. The result might be Christians who vote thoughtfully but hold their political commitments lightly, who work for justice through policy change while investing even more energy in direct service to the poor and marginalized, who engage political debates while remembering that their ultimate hope lies not in electoral victories but in the coming kingdom of God. As we conclude this exploration, it's worth remembering that Jesus himself provided the clearest guidance on this question. When asked about political obligations, he consistently redirected attention to deeper questions of spiritual allegiance and moral transformation. Maybe that's exactly what modern Christians need to hear. In an age of political polarization and partisan rage, Jesus' example offers a different way forward. Not withdrawal from public life, but engagement that maintains proper perspective on what politics can and cannot accomplish. The kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed remains the ultimate political vision, a community where the last become first, where enemies are transformed into friends, where justice and mercy embrace. No earthly government has ever achieved this vision, and none ever will. But citizens of that kingdom can work to approximate its values in whatever political systems they inhabit. They can vote or not vote, run for office or focus on community organizing, lobby for policy changes or concentrate on cultural transformation, all while remembering that their true citizenship lies elsewhere. In the end, the question of whether Jesus would vote might matter less than the question of how his followers can live as faithful citizens of his kingdom, while serving as constructive participants in earthly democracies. That's a question worth pondering long after this video ends. It's a question that might transform not just how we think about politics, but how we understand what it means to follow Jesus in a complex and broken world. Thanks for joining me on Professor Archive for this deep dive into history's most intriguing questions. If this exploration got you thinking in new ways, please like this video and consider subscribing for more content that bridges ancient wisdom and modern challenges. What do you think? Would Jesus vote, or would he find more effective ways to change the world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and often feature the best insights in future videos. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that the most important political act might just be learning to love your neighbors as yourself.